The bright, golden sun beamed over the small coastal town as Marcus Turner drove down the narrow streets, his two kids in the back seat excitedly chattering about their vacation. The ocean breeze drifted in through the windows, carrying the salt of the sea and mingling with the soft scent of sunscreen and freshly packed snacks. "We're almost there," Marcus's wife, Carla, exclaimed, glancing over her shoulder at their two children, Jamal and Zoe, who grinned with wide, eager eyes. Marcus took a deep breath, savoring the peaceful moment. It had been far too long since they'd had a family getaway like this. Between his job as an FBI agent, Carla's work as a lawyer, and the kids' school schedules, there was hardly ever a quiet moment to be together. Jamal, their 12-year-old, who often tried to appear unbothered by things, was visibly excited for once. "Mom, did you see the size of that beach back there? It's huge." Yeah, Zoe, who was 8, added, her tiny fists raised in excitement. "Can we go swimming right when we get there?" Carla chuckled and exchanged a smile with Marcus. "Let's get unpacked first, little fish," she said. "Then we'll see about swimming." Marcus navigated the winding roads with practiced ease, his gaze fixed on the small rental house up ahead. It was cozy, with a white picket fence, a short gravel driveway, and a small porch shaded by a wide, leafy tree. It was exactly the kind of place Marcus had dreamed of, a quiet escape from the bustle of their daily lives. As they pulled into the driveway, Marcus's phone buzzed on the console. He glanced at the screen and sighed, recognizing the name. It was his colleague, Agent Davis. "You're on vacation," Babe Carla reminded him, her voice gentle but firm. Marcus nodded, silencing the call, but he couldn't help feeling the itch of duty tugging at the back of his mind. The world of law enforcement was relentless, and though he was good at his job, he knew it came with a cost. His family had sacrificed so much for him to serve, and this trip was about giving back to them. "We're here," Zoe cheered, breaking his thoughts. In a flash, she and Jamal had undone their seatbelts and thrown open the doors, racing to be the first one inside the house. Marcus laughed, shaking off the tension. "Come on, let's see if we can keep up with them," he said to Carla, as he grabbed the keys and got out of the car. They unloaded their bags, taking in the calm, picturesque surroundings. Once inside, the kids darted through each room, shouting out discoveries. "Mom, Dad, there's a bunk bed," Jamal shouted from one of the bedrooms. "Look." A porch swing, Zoe's voice came from the front yard. Carla laughed, settling their bags in the living room. "I don't think they've ever been this excited about a vacation before." Marcus smiled as he walked over to the front porch, where Zoe was already swinging, her eyes closed as if absorbing the tranquil beauty of the place. "That's what I wanted for us, you know," he said quietly, looking over at Carla. "Just a place where we can breathe, where the kids can be kids without any worries for a while." Carla placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "And you too, Marcus. You deserve to relax too." She looked up at him, her gaze soft and understanding. Marcus nodded, feeling the tension begin to ease. The sight of his family in this calm setting did wonders for his spirit. It was everything he had hoped for. They spent the rest of the day settling in, with Carla organizing the kitchen while Marcus and the kids set up the bedrooms. By the time they'd unpacked, it was nearing sunset, and the sky had turned into a magnificent palette of orange and pink. "Let's go for a walk on the beach before dinner," Carla suggested. The kids practically flew out the door at the idea, with Marcus and Carla trailing behind, their hands intertwined as they strolled down the gravel path to the shoreline. The beach was serene, with only a few other families scattered along the shore. Waves lapped gently at the sand, and seagulls called out in the distance as they soared against the painted sky. Marcus watched as Zoe and Jamal chased each other near the water's edge, laughing and kicking up sand. It was a moment of pure joy, one that Marcus wanted to bottle up and keep forever. But he couldn't ignore the subtle glances he was starting to notice from a few passers-by locals who seemed curious, maybe even wary, of his family. "Do you feel that?" he asked Carla quietly, his gaze fixed on the kids. Carla followed his line of sight, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of a small group of teenagers nearby, their heads tilted in their direction, whispering amongst themselves. She squeezed Marcus's hand. "Yeah, I see it. But let's just enjoy tonight. We didn't come here to worry about other people's judgments." Marcus nodded, though a slight tension returned to his shoulders. Years on the force had trained him to pick up on subtle cues, and something about those glances lingered in his mind. But tonight he was determined to shake it off. They wandered down the beach as a family, pointing out shells and watching the sunset cast long shadows across the sand. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt grounded, surrounded by the people he loved most, far from the weight of his work. As night fell and they returned to the house, Carla prepared a simple dinner while Marcus entertained the kids with ghost stories. Laughter filled the small home, echoing against the walls and spilling out into the night. "All right, kids, bedtime," Carla announced once the dishes were cleared away. Jamal and Zoe protested, but she shot them a playful glare that sent them scurrying off to brush their teeth. Marcus chuckled, wrapping an arm around Carla as they tidied up the living room. "I don't think they've ever gone to bed that quickly before," he said, grinning. "Magic of the beach," Carla replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the muffled giggles of their children from down the hall. Marcus felt the weight of gratitude settle over him. They had this moment a small reprieve from the chaos of their lives. But as they drifted off to sleep, a faint sense of unease lingered at the edge of his mind, like a shadow in an otherwise bright room. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of seagulls and sunlight streaming in through the window. The scent of coffee wafted through the air, pulling him from the warmth of the bed. He found Carla in the kitchen, already dressed and sipping a steaming mug. "Morning, sleepyhead," she teased, her eyes sparkling. Marcus chuckled, stretching as he poured himself a cup. "It's been a while since I've been able to sleep in. What's on the agenda for today?" "Jamal wants to try his hand at fishing, and Zoe has already declared she's going to build the world's biggest sandcastle," Carla replied with a laugh. They spent the morning at the beach, with Jamal and Marcus trying their luck with fishing rods while Carla and Zoe built an elaborate sandcastle, complete with moats and towers. It was a scene straight out of a dream, simple, joyous, untouched by the outside world. As Marcus reeled in his line, he caught sight of an elderly couple watching them from a distance. They stood on the edge of the beach, their expressions unreadable, but Marcus sensed a certain hesitation in their stance. He tried to dismiss it, focusing instead on Jamal's chatter about the fish he planned to catch. But the feeling of being watched continued, following him throughout the day. Even as they strolled through the small town later, stopping by a cafe for ice cream and picking up souvenirs, Marcus noticed lingering gazes, subtle whispers as they passed. They tried to ignore it, but by the afternoon it was becoming harder to pretend it wasn't happening. In the grocery store, a man had openly stared at them, his eyes hard and cold. When Marcus had met his gaze, the man had simply turned away, but the hostility had been clear. "Is it just me, or are people here?" Less than welcoming, Carla whispered as they walked out of the store. Marcus clenched his jaw, a mixture of frustration and protectiveness bubbling within him. "It's not just you, but let's not let them ruin our time here. We're here as a family, and that's what matters." But Carla looked uneasy. "I know, Marcus, but I can't help feeling like maybe we should cut this trip short. I don't want anything happening to the kids." Marcus sighed, reaching for her hand. "Look, I get it, but we're not going to let other people's ignorance chase us away. We have every right to be here, to enjoy this time as a family. And if anyone has a problem with that, that's on them." Carla nodded, though worry still lingered in her eyes. They returned to the house, trying to brush off the day's encounters. But Marcus couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. Years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming at him. That night, as he lay in bed, he found himself staring up at the ceiling, wide awake. The sounds of the town drifted in through the window, the distant crash of waves, the rustle of the wind through the trees. But beneath it all, there was a hum of unease, an invisible weight pressing down on him. He glanced over at Carla, who was fast asleep, her face peaceful. He envied her ability to brush things off, to focus on the here and now. For her, this trip was a chance to escape. For Marcus, it was a reminder of the world they lived in, a world where he was constantly on guard, always alert. The next day, he vowed to relax, to focus solely on his family and their time together. But as he drifted into a restless sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that their presence here was a disruption, an unwelcome challenge to the quiet prejudices of this small town. and he had a sinking feeling that those prejudices would soon come to the surface. The morning sun shone brightly over the beach, the kind of warm light that made the sand shimmer and waves dance in a soft blue hue. Zoe and Jamal were already splashing in the shallow water, their laughter filling the air. Marcus watched them from the beach chair he'd set up under a wide, colorful umbrella. He was finally starting to unwind, to let go of the tension that had lingered since they'd arrived. Carla, lying on the towel next to him with a novel in hand, nudged him with her elbow. "Look at us," she said, grinning. "Can you even remember the last time we just sat back and relaxed like this?" Marcus chuckled, closing his eyes and leaning back. "I'll admit, it's been a while. Feels good," though he took a deep breath, inhaling the salty ocean air, letting the peaceful atmosphere wash over him. For a moment, it was easy to forget everything else. But just as he was starting to drift into a comfortable lull, he heard Jamal's voice rise in pitch, breaking through the peaceful quiet of the beach. "Hey, leave us alone," Jamal's voice echoed from the water. Marcus sat up, his eyes immediately darting toward the children. He saw Zoe standing close to her brother, her hands clenched as she looked at a group of teens surrounding them. The teens, probably about 16 or 17, laughed and nudged each other, their faces twisted into smug grins. Carla put her book down and sat up, worry tightening her face. "Marcus." "I see it," he replied, already getting up. His calm was shattered in an instant, his instincts on high alert. As he approached the kids, he could hear the taunts the teens were throwing at Jamal and Zoe. "What's wrong?" Little man, one of the boys sneered, stepping closer to Jamal. He was tall and lanky, with a mess of blonde hair falling into his eyes. "Can't handle a little fun." Jamal stood his ground, though Marcus could see the anger flaring in his son's eyes. "I said leave us alone," Jamal repeated, his voice steady but taut. "Yeah, get lost," Zoe added, her small hands balled into fists as she glared at the teens. Marcus reached them just as one of the other teens, a girl with bright red nail polish and a mocking smile, leaned down to Zoe's eye level. "Oh, we're just having a little chat, nothing wrong with that, right?" she said with a sickly sweet tone, smirking as she spoke. "All right, that's enough," Marcus said firmly, stepping between the teens and his kids. His voice was calm, but there was a hard edge to it, a warning he didn't bother to hide. The blonde teen looked up at Marcus, his grin fading slightly. He raised an eyebrow, glancing back at his friends with a smirk. "We were just messing around, man. No need to get all serious." "Messing around," Marcus repeated, his gaze hardening. "My kids asked you to leave them alone. I suggest you listen." There was a tense silence as the teen sized him up, the blonde boy's smirk turning into a sneer. "Look, we don't want any trouble," he said, holding his hands up in mock surrender. But his eyes gleamed with a quiet defiance, the kind of entitlement Marcus had seen too many times before. "Then walk away," Marcus replied, his voice calm but unyielding. After a beat, the teens shrugged, exchanging mocking glances before finally backing off, muttering under their breath as they sauntered away. One of the girls looked back, her eyes flashing with annoyance. "Some people really don't know how to take a joke," she said loudly enough for Marcus and his family to hear. Jamal let out a shaky breath, his shoulders relaxing as he watched the teens disappear down the beach. Marcus placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," Jamal muttered, though his expression remained tense. "I just didn't want them bothering us." Zoe nodded, her face determined. "They were being mean," she added, looking up at Marcus with wide, serious eyes. Marcus managed a reassuring smile. "Well, you both did great. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here, all right?" They nodded, but he could see the frustration simmering in Jamal's eyes. It pained Marcus to know that his kids were already facing such prejudice even at a young age. He had hoped to shield them from this reality for a little while longer, but the world had a way of forcing it on them sooner than he'd ever wanted. They spent the rest of the morning on the beach, trying to shake off the encounter. Zoe and Jamal resumed their games, though Marcus noticed Jamal casting wary glances down the beach every so often. Carla tried to distract him with lighthearted conversation, but the tension lingered. As they packed up to leave, Marcus noticed two police officers walking down the beach, their eyes scanning the area with careful scrutiny. His pulse quickened instinctively, though he forced himself to remain calm. They were just passing through, he told himself. Nothing to worry about. But as they turned their attention to his family, his gut tightened. The officers, a man with a buzz cut and a tall, thin woman with sharp features, were heading directly toward them. Carla noticed it too, glancing at Marcus with a mix of confusion and concern. "Marcus." "Stay calm," he murmured, his hand lightly touching her arm. He turned to face the officers as they approached, putting on a polite but firm expression. "Afternoon, officers," he greeted them. The male officer eyed him with a steely gaze, his expression unreadable. "Afternoon," he replied, glancing over Marcus, Carla, and the kids. "We had a report of a disturbance here. Mind telling us what happened?" Marcus felt a flash of irritation but kept his voice steady. "There was a group of teens bothering my kids earlier. They were being disrespectful, but we asked them to leave, and they did." The female officer narrowed her eyes slightly. "We got a call that there was some sort of altercation. Were there any threats made?" "No threats," Marcus replied, though he noticed the way she seemed to search his face as if looking for a reason to doubt him. "Just a misunderstanding." Jamal, who had been standing quietly next to his mother, suddenly spoke up. "They were the ones being mean. They wouldn't leave us alone." The officers exchanged a look, and Marcus felt his patience fraying. He had dealt with this kind of suspicion before, the way some people looked at him, questioning his every word, his every move. The male officer turned his attention back to Marcus, his expression hardening. "And you didn't try to say handle the situation yourself?" Marcus clenched his jaw, keeping his tone controlled. "I intervened to protect my kids, nothing more. Like I said, they left peacefully." The officer's eyes narrowed and he took a step closer, his hand resting on his belt. "Well, we're going to need to get some ID from you all, just to make sure we're clear on what happened here." Carla tensed beside him, her face a mixture of frustration and worry. Marcus could feel his own frustration boiling beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew from experience that getting defensive would only make things worse. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet and handing over his ID. "I'm Marcus Turner, FBI," he said, keeping his voice steady but firm. "And I assure you, nothing happened here that would require police involvement." The officer's eyes flickered as he examined the ID, but he didn't seem impressed. Instead, he looked back at Marcus with a skeptical expression, as if doubting the authenticity of the badge. The female officer shifted, glancing at Carla and the kids with a scrutinizing gaze. "And you're here on vacation?" the male officer asked, his tone laced with doubt. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice holding an edge of impatience. "With my family." The officer's gaze lingered on him for a moment before he finally handed the ID back. "Well, just be aware that people around here don't take kindly to disturbances. We'll be keeping an eye on things." Marcus held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I hope that won't be necessary. We're here to relax, just like everyone else." The officer gave a curt nod before turning to leave, his partner following close behind. Marcus watched them go, his shoulders tense, the familiar weight of frustration settling over him. Once they were out of earshot, Carla let out a shaky breath. "Marcus, what was that about?" "They were called here because someone thought we were a threat," he replied, his voice bitter. He glanced at his kids, who were looking at him with wide, worried eyes. "It's fine. We didn't do anything wrong." But as they packed up their things and left the beach, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The looks, the whispers, the suspicion, it was all building, a quiet storm gathering around them, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it broke. Later that evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Jamal broke the silence that had hung over them since they left the beach. "Dad, why did those cops think we did something wrong?" Marcus looked at his son, a pang of pain hitting him as he saw the confusion and hurt in his eyes. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, the words he had hoped to avoid having to say. Sometimes, he began, his voice gentle, people make assumptions about others, even when they don't know them. They see something they don't understand, and instead of asking questions, they jump to conclusions. Jamal frowned, his brow furrowed. "But we didn't do anything, we were just playing." Marcus nodded, feeling a heaviness settle over him. "I know, and it's not fair, but that's just how some people are. It doesn't mean we've done anything wrong." Zoe looked up at him, her small face scrunched in confusion. But why would they think that about us? Marcus looked at Carla, who gave him a small nod, encouraging him to continue. He turned back to the kids, his heart heavy. Sometimes people judge others based on how they look or where they come from. It's wrong, but it happens. There was a long, heavy silence as the kids absorbed his words. Carla reached over, placing a comforting hand on his. "We're a strong family," she said softly. "And as long as we stick together, we can face anything." Marcus squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with gratitude for her support. But even as he reassured his kids, he couldn't ignore the simmering anger within him. He had come here to escape the pressures of his job, the weight of constantly being on guard. But it seemed that no matter where he went, he couldn't escape the shadow of prejudice. As they cleared the table and prepared for bed, Marcus found himself staring out the window, watching the darkened beach in the distance. The ocean waves rolled gently under the moonlight, the sight soothing yet somehow taunting. He had wanted to give his family peace, a break from the world's judgments and dangers, but now he was beginning to wonder if that peace was even possible. In that moment, he made a silent vow to himself. He would protect his family, no matter what. They deserved this time together, this break from the world's chaos, and he wouldn't let anyone take that from them. No matter how many looks they received, no matter how many whispers followed them, he would stand firm. But as he closed the window and locked the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was still coming, and he was no longer sure he could keep it at bay. The days that followed their encounter with the police were tense, but Marcus was determined to hold on to the semblance of peace they had come here to find. Every morning, he and Carla reassured the kids that everything was fine, that they were just there to enjoy the beach and time together. But an invisible weight seemed to follow them. The whispers, the curious glances, and the wary looks were constant reminders that their presence was unwelcome. On the third day, Marcus decided to take Jamal and Zoe out to a nearby park for some fresh air. Carla had stayed back at the house, catching up on a novel she'd brought along. The park was quiet, with families scattered across the grounds enjoying picnics or playing frisbee. He watched his children join a group of kids playing on the jungle gym, laughing and chasing each other through the swings and slides. Marcus settled on a bench nearby, grateful to see his kids so carefree. It was these moments that made all the trouble worth it, seeing Jamal and Zoe happy and immersed in the simple joys of childhood. He knew that the world would find ways to erode that innocence soon enough, but for now he just wanted them to feel free and secure. As Marcus lost himself in the tranquility of the moment, a familiar sense of unease crept over him. Looking up, he spotted the same two officers from the beach slowly patrolling the park's perimeter. They moved with deliberate steps, their eyes scanning the park as if looking for something or someone. The male officer noticed Marcus and paused, his gaze narrowing. For a moment, Marcus thought he might ignore them and move along. But then, with a barely perceptible nod to his partner, the officer began to approach. Marcus tensed, his instinct telling him to be ready for anything. His mind raced, trying to think of what might have triggered their attention this time. They hadn't caused any commotion, hadn't done anything but play quietly in the park. But as the officer neared, Marcus recognized the look in his eyes, a look he had seen too often in his line of work. It was the look of someone with a target in sight. The officer's partner, the woman with the sharp features, followed closely behind, her expression unreadable but her stance equally assertive. Marcus straightened in his seat, his heart pounding but his exterior calm. He wasn't going to let them see any fear or hesitation. Afternoon, the male officer greeted curtly, his voice carrying an air of authority. Marcus nodded, keeping his tone neutral. "Afternoon, officers. Is there something I can help you with?" The officer's eyes flicked toward the playground where Jamal and Zoe played. "We've received some complaints about a man matching your description loitering around the park," he said, his voice barely hiding a note of accusation. Marcus's jaw tightened. "I'm here with my kids," he replied, gesturing toward the playground. "Just enjoying a day at the park, same as everyone else." The female officer stepped forward, her eyes sharp. "We'll need to verify that, sir," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "Can we see some ID?" Marcus hesitated, his mind racing with indignation. He knew they had no real reason to suspect him of anything, but he also knew that refusal could only make things worse. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his ID and handing it to the officer. The male officer examined the ID, his gaze hardening when he saw Marcus's FBI badge. A slight sneer appeared on his face. "Well, looks like we've got ourselves a special agent," he muttered, handing the badge to his partner. She raised an eyebrow as she examined it, but said nothing. "We appreciate the cooperation," the male officer said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "But we're going to need to ask a few questions, just to clear up some concerns that have been raised." "Concerns?" Marcus repeated, his voice steady but tinged with irritation. "What kind of concerns?" The officer shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Just some reports about suspicious activity. People have noticed you hanging around, and we need to make sure everything is above board." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd been in situations like this before, but never in front of his kids. The thought of them seeing him treated this way was infuriating. "There's nothing suspicious about a father spending time with his kids," Marcus replied, his voice hardening. The officer's sneer deepened. "Maybe not where you're from, but around here we like to be cautious." Before Marcus could respond, he heard a voice call out from the playground. "Dad!" Jamal shouted, running over with Zoe following close behind, her face full of worry. "Is everything okay?" Jamal asked, looking between his father and the officers with wide, fearful eyes. Marcus crouched down to meet Jamal's gaze, trying to keep his voice calm. "Everything's fine, buddy. These officers just wanted to ask me a few questions, that's all." But the male officer's gaze was locked onto Jamal, his expression hardening further. "Your son?" he asked, his tone suspicious. Marcus felt a flash of anger. "Yes, my son." The officer looked unconvinced, and the female officer exchanged a glance with her partner. "Well, it's still our duty to investigate," she said, her voice cold. The male officer stepped closer. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us to the station." Marcus's stomach dropped. "Excuse me? There's no reason for me to go to the station. I've done nothing wrong." The officer's hand moved toward his belt, his posture shifting into one of authority. "I'm not going to argue, sir. We can do this the easy way, or we can make it difficult. It's up to you." Carla, who had just arrived at the park to join them, caught sight of the scene and rushed over, panic evident in her eyes. "What's going on here?" The female officer stepped forward, blocking Carla's path. "Ma'am, please stay back." Carla's eyes widened in fear and anger. "Stay back? That's my husband. He hasn't done anything wrong." The male officer ignored her, focusing solely on Marcus. "We can either do this with you cooperating, or we can do it another way." Marcus felt his blood boil, every fiber of his being resisting the urge to lash out. But he knew that any reaction would only be used against him. He turned to Carla, meeting her worried gaze with as much calm as he could muster. "Take the kids back to the house," he said quietly, his voice barely concealing the fury beneath. "I'll handle this." Carla looked at him, desperation in her eyes, but she nodded, gathering Jamal and Zoe close. Jamal's face was twisted with confusion and anger, his eyes wet with unshed tears. "No, Dad," Jamal protested, clinging to his father's arm. "They can't just take you." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Jamal. I'll be back soon, all right?" The female officer stepped forward, her voice stern. "Let's go, sir." With a deep breath, Marcus rose to his feet, casting one last look at his family. He could see the fear in Carla's eyes, the confusion and hurt on his children's faces. But he forced himself to turn away, following the officers as they led him toward the squad car parked at the edge of the park. They didn't bother with explanations or even basic respect. As they reached the car, the male officer roughly grabbed Marcus's arm, twisting it behind his back as he snapped on the handcuffs. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, his voice low with anger. The officer ignored him, pushing him into the back seat without another word. The ride to the station was silent, tension crackling in the air. Marcus sat in the back seat, his wrists cuffed painfully behind him, his mind racing. He knew they had no real reason to detain him, no legitimate grounds for suspicion. But he also knew that these officers saw him as a threat simply because of who he was, how he looked. As they pulled into the station, Marcus's resolve hardened. He would cooperate, answer their questions, but he would not let them humiliate him. He was an agent of the law himself, and he refused to let these officers strip him of his dignity. Inside the station, they led him to a small interrogation room, its walls cold and bare. The male officer stayed by the door, his gaze fixed on Marcus with an air of contempt. The female officer took a seat across from him, her expression unreadable. "Mind telling us why you're here?" she asked, her tone cold. Marcus met her gaze, his own voice calm but laced with defiance. "I'm here on vacation with my family, nothing more. I've done nothing wrong, and you know it." The female officer raised an eyebrow, as if amused. "Funny. We've had multiple complaints about a man matching your description causing trouble around town." "Trouble," Marcus repeated, his anger barely contained. "If by trouble you mean spending time with my kids, then maybe you should rethink what you consider a threat." The male officer scoffed, crossing his arms. "Spare us the lecture. You might be a big shot with the FBI, but here you're just another suspect." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Is that so? Well, I'd like to see the evidence you have to detain me. Or am I here because I look different from the people you're used to seeing in this town?" The officers exchanged glances, and for a moment, Marcus saw a flicker of uncertainty in the female officer's eyes. But the male officer quickly stepped in, his voice dripping with disdain. "We don't need to explain ourselves to you," he said. "You're here because we received multiple complaints, and we're doing our job." Marcus met his gaze, refusing to back down. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to harass law-abiding citizens." The male officer's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, there was a knock on the door. Another officer entered, his expression tense. "There's a call for you," he said to the male officer. "It's from the FBI." The male officer's face paled slightly, and he exchanged a glance with his partner. With a grunt, he rose to his feet, stepping out of the room. Marcus watched him go, a sense of satisfaction mingling with his anger. At least someone was paying attention. A few minutes later, the officer returned, his expression tight. Without meeting Marcus's gaze, he muttered, "You're free to go." Marcus rose to his feet, rubbing his wrists as he removed the handcuffs. "I hope you'll remember this the next time you feel the need to harass an innocent man," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. The officers said nothing, their faces tight with anger and embarrassment. Marcus walked out of the station, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and fury. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it, but as he stepped into the sunlight, he felt a surge of determination. He would protect his family, no matter what. But as he made his way back to the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that this town and its police were far from done with him. And he knew, deep down, that he couldn't let this slide. Something had to change. Marcus walked out of the station, his heart pounding and his mind racing. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the gravity of what had just happened. He thought about how it would feel to see Carla and the kids, and he wasn't sure what was worse, the anger brewing inside him or the thought of explaining this humiliation to them. As he walked down the quiet streets back toward their rental, his mind replayed every moment of the arrest, the cold indifference in the officers' eyes, their casual dismissal of his FBI credentials, the scorn they had in their voices. His fists clenched involuntarily as he remembered the look on Jamal's face, the fear in Zoe's eyes as they watched him being taken away in handcuffs. By the time Marcus reached the house, it was nearly dusk, and the soft glow of the porch light cast a warm hue over the small front yard. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, to put on a brave face for his family. He knew he had to find the strength to be the rock they needed right now, no matter how torn he felt inside. As he opened the front door, he was met by Carla's anxious gaze. She was waiting for him in the hallway, arms crossed, her face tight with worry and anger. The kids sat in the living room, their eyes fixed on the door the moment he walked in. Carla's expression softened, her eyes scanning him for any sign of harm. "Marcus, thank God you're okay," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. Marcus held her close, letting the warmth of her presence calm the storm raging inside him. "I'm okay, Carla," he murmured. "I'm okay." He felt Jamal's presence next to him, his son standing with a mixture of relief and anger in his eyes. "Dad, why did they do that?" Jamal asked, his voice tinged with the frustration he had clearly been holding in. Marcus pulled back from Carla, turning to his son. He could see the confusion, the hurt, the struggle to understand why his father, who had always been his hero, had been treated like a criminal. "It's complicated," son Marcus replied, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people let their own fears and prejudices cloud their judgment. They think they know who you are just by looking at you, and they act on those assumptions." "But you didn't do anything wrong," Jamal insisted, his voice rising with emotion. "They didn't even listen when you told them you were an FBI agent." Marcus's heart ached as he looked into his son's eyes, seeing the pain and frustration mirrored there. He wanted to tell Jamal that it would all be okay, that the world wasn't as unjust as it seemed. But he knew that would be a lie. He knew that Jamal was old enough to understand some of the hard truths, whether he liked it or not. "No, they didn't," Marcus admitted, his voice somber. "But that doesn't make what they did right. And it doesn't mean we won't stand up for ourselves." Zoe, who had been sitting silently on the couch, finally spoke up, her small voice quivering. "Are they going to take you away again, Daddy?" Marcus knelt down to meet her gaze, a gentle smile on his face. "No, sweetheart. They won't take me away again. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." He reached out and hugged her, feeling her tiny arms wrapped tightly around his neck. Her trust and love washed over him, a reminder of what mattered most. Carla joined them, wrapping her arms around both Marcus and Zoe. "We're all in this together," she said softly, her voice steady with conviction. After a long moment, they finally pulled apart, and Carla gestured for Marcus to join her in the kitchen. Once the kids were settled with the movie, she leaned against the counter, her face tense. "Marcus," she began, her voice low, "this isn't just some misunderstanding. They're targeting you." "Us. I don't know if it's the color of our skin, the fact that we're new here, or both, but I can't just sit back and let this happen to you." Marcus nodded, running a hand over his face. "I know, Carla. Believe me, I know. But what can we do? We're just here on vacation. These people see us as outsiders, as a threat for no reason other than their own biases." Carla's eyes flashed with determination. "Then we make them see us differently. We're not going to let them run us out of here. This is our time together, our vacation, and they don't get to ruin that for us." Marcus felt a surge of pride as he looked at her, admiring the strength and resolve in her eyes. "You're right," he said, his voice firm. "We've done nothing wrong, and we won't let them make us feel like we have." As they prepared for dinner, Marcus couldn't help but feel a new sense of purpose growing inside him. This wasn't just about their family vacation anymore. It was about standing up against prejudice, against injustice, no matter where it came from. Later that night, after the kids were in bed, Marcus sat on the porch, watching the stars twinkle against the dark sky. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, surprised to see it was his colleague, Agent Davis. Marcus Davis greeted him, his voice cautious. "I heard about what happened. Are you all right?" Marcus sighed, leaning back in the porch chair. "Yeah, I'm okay, but it's been rough. The local cops here are making life difficult, to say the least." Davis was silent for a moment before speaking again. "Look, if you need backup or support, say the word. We take care of our own, Marcus." The offer touched him, a reminder that he had allies beyond this small, hostile town. But Marcus also knew that accepting help would mean escalating the situation, potentially making things even more difficult for his family. "I appreciate it, Davis. Really, I do," he replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "But for now, I think I'll handle it here. I don't want to bring the Bureau into something that might make it worse for Carla and the kids." Davis hesitated. "All right. But if things get out of hand, promise you'll reach out." Marcus nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "I promise." After ending the call, Marcus stayed on the porch, his mind racing. He knew he was doing the right thing by trying to shield his family from further confrontation, but the anger inside him simmered, refusing to be suppressed. He was tired of being seen as a threat, as less than, simply because of the color of his skin. He was a father, a husband, a protector, and he had worked tirelessly to uphold the law. He'd put his life on the line for justice, for fairness, and to be treated like a criminal felt like a slap in the face. He made a silent vow to himself. He would protect his family no matter what, and he would not back down from anyone who tried to undermine their dignity, their safety, or their peace. The next day, Marcus and his family ventured out once again, determined to reclaim their vacation and show the town they wouldn't be intimidated. They decided to visit a local museum, hoping it would be a peaceful outing away from the prying eyes and harsh judgments they'd faced so far. The museum was small but charming, filled with local art and historical artifacts. Zoe was particularly fascinated by the exhibits, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in each piece. Jamal, however, seemed distracted, his face tense. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting trouble to appear at any moment. Marcus noticed his son's anxiety and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Hey, everything okay?" Jamal shrugged, his eyes focused on a painting of the ocean. I don't like how people keep staring at us. It feels like they're waiting for us to mess up." Marcus's heart ached at the words, but he kept his voice calm. "I know, buddy, but remember we're here to enjoy ourselves. What they think of us doesn't matter." Jamal looked up at him, his face a mixture of frustration and determination. "I just don't get it, Dad. Why can't they see that we're just like them?" Marcus wished he had an easy answer, but he knew that there was no simple way to explain the deep-rooted biases that drove people to judge others based on appearances alone. "Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand," he said gently. "But that doesn't mean we have to let their fear affect us." Jamal nodded, though his expression remained somber. Marcus knew it was a hard lesson for his son to grasp, especially at such a young age, but he hoped that, in time, Jamal would learn to rise above the small-mindedness of others. After their trip to the museum, they decided to stop by a local cafe for lunch. The small space was cozy, with wooden tables and colorful paintings adorning the walls. They ordered sandwiches and drinks, hoping for a quiet meal. But as they sat down, Marcus noticed a group of locals at a nearby table watching them with thinly veiled disdain. One of the men leaned over to his friend, whispering something that made the others snicker. Carla tensed, her gaze fixed on the table. "Marcus," she murmured, a warning in her tone. "I see it," he replied quietly, his own patience wearing thin. Just as he was about to ignore them, the man at the table turned to him with a forced smile. "You folks here for a while?" he asked, his voice dripping with insincerity. Marcus kept his tone polite but firm. "Just enjoying a family vacation." The man nodded, his smile widening. "Well, don't go causing any trouble. We like to keep things peaceful around here." Carla's hand tightened around her coffee cup, but Marcus held up a hand, silently asking her to let it go. He met the man's gaze, his own smile cold. "We're not here to cause any trouble, just minding our own business." The man's smirk faded, and he muttered something under his breath before turning back to his friends. Marcus could feel the tension radiating from Carla and the kids, but he refused to let these people get the better of him. As they finished their meal and prepared to leave, Marcus glanced back at the table, meeting the man's gaze one last time. He didn't say anything, but his expression spoke volumes. He was done playing by their rules, done tiptoeing around their prejudices. This was his family, his life, and he would defend it with every ounce of strength he had. "You said, proceed with Act 4 with a strictly minimum of 2,500 words," ChatGPT said. Here's Act 4, where Marcus confronts the police force, shedding light on his unjust arrest and bringing his story to the attention of the town. This act heightens the drama as Marcus strives for accountability, while the tension within his family deepens in the face of community hostility. Act 4, exposing the truth. The next morning, Marcus awoke with a resolve as steely as the dark gray clouds gathering on the horizon. He'd spent most of the night replaying the arrest in his mind, feeling the humiliation and injustice each time like a fresh wound. But what lingered most was the look on Jamal's face, his son's wide, wounded eyes watching him in handcuffs. That was something Marcus could never forgive. After a quiet breakfast, he told Carla he needed to take care of something alone. She looked at him, worry etched into her face, but she nodded in understanding. She knew him well enough to see that he couldn't rest until he'd taken a stand. "I'll take the kids to the beach," Carla said, her voice soft but supportive. "They could use a break, and so could you." Marcus gave her a grateful nod, taking her hand for a moment before he left. It was a simple gesture, but one that grounded him, giving him the strength he needed. This wasn't just about him, this was about his family, his children, and the future they deserved. As he drove into town, Marcus felt the familiar adrenaline of facing a confrontation. This time, however, he wasn't wearing his FBI badge as a shield. He was going as a father, a man demanding accountability. This wasn't just another case, it was personal. He parked outside the police station, the building squat and foreboding with its dull brick facade and narrow windows. Squaring his shoulders, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The receptionist looked up, surprise flickering across her face as she recognized him. "I need to speak with Chief Williams," Marcus said, his voice firm and unwavering. The receptionist blinked, clearly taken aback by his directness. "One moment, please," she stammered, reaching for the phone. After a few tense moments, she hung up and nodded. "The chief will see you. Right through those doors." Marcus strode down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the sterile, white-tiled walls. He could feel the eyes of officers and staff following him, their expressions a mixture of surprise and unease. He reached the chief's office, knocking once before stepping inside. Chief Williams sat behind a massive wooden desk, his salt and pepper hair combed neatly, his expression carefully neutral. He gestured to the chair across from him, though Marcus made no move to sit. "Agent Turner," Chief Williams began, his tone formal. "I understand you wanted to discuss the events of yesterday." "That's correct," Marcus replied, crossing his arms. "And it's Mr. Turner, as I'm not here in an official capacity." The chief's eyes flickered, a faint hint of irritation crossing his face. "Very well, Mr. Turner. Let's hear it." Marcus held his gaze, his voice steady but laced with an underlying fury. "I'd like to know why I was detained yesterday. Why your officers felt the need to arrest me in front of my children without any legitimate cause." Chief Williams leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "We had reports of suspicious behavior. Our officers were doing their duty to ensure the safety of the community." "Suspicious behavior," Marcus repeated, incredulous. "Spending time with my children at a public park is suspicious behavior now." The chief's expression remained impassive. "We have a duty to respond to any concerns raised by the community, Mr. Turner. Surely you can understand that." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he kept his tone controlled. "What I understand, Chief, is that your officers made a judgment based on appearances. They saw a black man with his kids and assumed the worst. You know that's not how this should work." Chief Williams shifted uncomfortably in his chair, though he quickly masked it. "I'm sure you're aware, Mr. Turner, that officers are trained to act on their instincts. They believed there was a reason to investigate, and they followed protocol." "Protocol?" Marcus's voice hardened. "I'm familiar with protocol, Chief. I know that what your officers did was not only unprofessional but entirely unfounded. They ignored my badge, my credentials, and my rights. They humiliated me in front of my family based on nothing but prejudice." The chief's jaw clenched, his mask of neutrality slipping for a moment. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Turner, but I stand by my officers' actions. They were doing their job." Marcus took a deep breath, his patience wearing thin. Doing their job or acting on biases they've never had to confront. "This town has a problem, Chief, and it's clear your department is at the heart of it." Chief Williams bristled, his face flushed. "I don't appreciate your insinuations. My department operates with integrity." "Integrity," Marcus said, his voice rising. "If that were true, I wouldn't be here right now. I'm not asking for special treatment, Chief. I'm asking for fair treatment for myself and every person who comes through this town." The chief's gaze hardened, his posture stiffening. "Perhaps, Mr. Turner, you're simply not used to being questioned. In this town, everyone is subject to the same scrutiny." Marcus let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "That's the problem, Chief. I'm not afraid of scrutiny. I'm afraid of a system that treats innocent people as guilty based on the color of their skin." A tense silence fell between them, the air thick with unspoken resentment. Finally, Chief Williams looked away, his jaw tight. "I'll review the incident with my officers. That's all I can promise." Marcus nodded, though he knew it was little more than a hollow gesture. "I'll be expecting a follow-up, Chief. And if there isn't one, I have no problem taking this higher up. I know people in the Bureau who would be very interested in this story." The chief's face paled slightly, and Marcus could see the hint of fear in his eyes. Good, he thought. Let him feel a fraction of the fear his family had felt. Without another word, Marcus turned and left the office, his shoulders squared and his mind resolute. He was far from finished with this fight. Outside the station, Marcus felt a sense of release, a weight lifted from his chest. He'd confronted the chief, exposed the prejudice in the department for what it was. But as he walked down the street, he noticed people staring, their faces filled with suspicion and judgment. It wasn't just the police, it was the entire town. The realization hit him hard, settling in his gut like a stone. These people didn't see him or his family as equals. To them, they were intruders, a disruption to the quiet ignorance they had grown comfortable in. Determined, Marcus made his way to the local community center. If this town wanted to watch, he'd give them something worth seeing. He approached the director, a middle-aged woman with a friendly demeanor, and introduced himself. "Is there a space I could use for a small gathering?" he asked. "I'd like to speak to anyone who's interested in addressing the recent incidents with the police." The woman hesitated, her eyes widening slightly as she took in his determined expression. Well, we usually don't host meetings on such short notice, but I suppose we could set something up in the multipurpose room." "Thank you," Marcus replied, feeling a sense of purpose surge through him. An hour later, Marcus stood in front of a small gathering of locals, his heart pounding as he looked out at the faces staring back at him. There were curious expressions, skeptical frowns, and a few looks of open hostility. But there were also a few who seemed genuinely interested, their faces soft with curiosity. He took a deep breath, letting the tension melt away as he began to speak. "My name is Marcus Turner, and I'm here with my family on vacation. We came to this town hoping for a peaceful, relaxing break. Instead, we faced judgment, suspicion, and hostility simply because we don't look like everyone else here." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Marcus continued, his voice strong. "I've spent my life in law enforcement, working as an FBI agent, putting myself on the line to protect people, to uphold justice. But the treatment we've experienced here has made me question whether justice is even possible in a place like this." He could see the tension in the room, the uncomfortable shifting of bodies as people listened. But he pressed on, refusing to back down. "I was arrested without cause, humiliated in front of my children. And when I confronted the police chief about it, he dismissed it as protocol. As standard procedure." He shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his face. "Well, I'm here to say that this isn't right. It's not right to judge someone based on the color of their skin. It's not right to assume guilt based on appearance." A hand went up in the back, and Marcus nodded toward the young man who had raised it. "Do you really think there's a problem here, or is this just a misunderstanding?" the man asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Marcus looked him directly in the eye. "This isn't about misunderstandings. This is about a culture of prejudice, of fear and suspicion that goes unchecked. My family and I are not here to cause trouble, but we won't tolerate being treated like criminals just because we're different." A few people nodded, a murmur of agreement spreading through the crowd. Others crossed their arms, their expressions hard, but Marcus didn't let it faze him. "We're all part of this community," he continued, his voice steady. "And we all have a responsibility to make it better, to make it fair. I'm not asking for special treatment, I'm asking for equal treatment." The director of the community center, who had been standing at the back, stepped forward, her face thoughtful. "Thank you for speaking up, Mr. Turner. This town, well, maybe it does need to hear this. We could use some changes." A smattering of applause followed her words, and Marcus felt a glimmer of hope spark within him. This was just the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. As the crowd dispersed, a few people approached Marcus, shaking his hand and offering words of support. Some of them had stories of their own relatives or friends who had experienced similar treatment, moments that had gone unaddressed in the quiet corners of the town. Carla joined him after the meeting, her hand slipping into his, her eyes filled with pride. "You did it, Marcus," she said softly. "You stood up, and people listened." Marcus squeezed her hand, feeling a warmth spread through him. "It's a start," he replied, his voice filled with determination. "And we're not done yet." Together they walked out of the community center, the dark clouds overhead breaking to reveal a sliver of sunlight. It was a small sign, but one that filled Marcus with hope. The road ahead would be long, and the battles far from over, but he knew one thing for certain. He would keep fighting for his family, for justice, and for the promise of a better, fairer world. The next morning, Marcus awoke with a resolve as steely as the dark gray clouds gathering on the horizon. He'd spent most of the night replaying the arrest in his mind, feeling the humiliation and injustice each time like a fresh wound. But what lingered most was the look on Jamal's face, his son's wide, wounded eyes watching him in handcuffs. That was something Marcus could never forgive. After a quiet breakfast, he told Carla he needed to take care of something alone. She looked at him, worry etched into her face, but she nodded in understanding. She knew him well enough to see that he couldn't rest until he'd taken a stand. "I'll take the kids to the beach," Carla said, her voice soft but supportive. "They could use a break, and so could you." Marcus gave her a grateful nod, taking her hand for a moment before he left. It was a simple gesture, but one that grounded him, giving him the strength he needed. This wasn't just about him, this was about his family, his children, and the future they deserved. As he drove into town, Marcus felt the familiar adrenaline of facing a confrontation. This time, however, he wasn't wearing his FBI badge as a shield. He was going as a father, a man demanding accountability. This wasn't just another case, it was personal. He parked outside the police station, the building squat and foreboding with its dull brick facade and narrow windows. Squaring his shoulders, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The receptionist looked up, surprise flickering across her face as she recognized him. "I need to speak with Chief Williams," Marcus said, his voice firm and unwavering. The receptionist blinked, clearly taken aback by his directness. One moment, please," she stammered, reaching for the phone. After a few tense moments, she hung up and nodded. "The chief will see you, right through those doors." Marcus strode down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the sterile, white-tiled walls. He could feel the eyes of officers and staff following him, their expressions a mixture of surprise and unease. He reached the chief's office, knocking once before stepping inside. Chief Williams sat behind a massive wooden desk, his salt and pepper hair combed neatly, his expression carefully neutral. He gestured to the chair across from him, though Marcus made no move to sit. "Agent Turner," Chief Williams began, his tone formal. "I understand you wanted to discuss the events of yesterday." "That's correct," Marcus replied, crossing his arms. "And it's Mr. Turner, as I'm not here in an official capacity." The chief's eyes flickered, a faint hint of irritation crossing his face. "Very well, Mr. Turner. Let's hear it." Marcus held his gaze, his voice steady but laced with an underlying fury. "I'd like to know why I was detained yesterday. Why your officers felt the need to arrest me in front of my children without any legitimate cause." Chief Williams leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "We had reports of suspicious behavior. Our officers were doing their duty to ensure the safety of the community." "Suspicious behavior," Marcus repeated, incredulous. "Spending time with my children at a public park is suspicious behavior now." The chief's expression remained impassive. "We have a duty to respond to any concerns raised by the community, Mr. Turner. Surely you can understand that." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he kept his tone controlled. "What I understand, Chief, is that your officers made a judgment based on appearances. They saw a black man with his kids and assumed the worst. You know that's not how this should work." Chief Williams shifted uncomfortably in his chair, though he quickly masked it. "I'm sure you're aware, Mr. Turner, that officers are trained to act on their instincts. They believed there was a reason to investigate, and they followed protocol." "Protocol?" Marcus's voice hardened. "I'm familiar with protocol, Chief. I know that what your officers did was not only unprofessional but entirely unfounded. They ignored my badge, my credentials, and my rights. They humiliated me in front of my family based on nothing but prejudice." The chief's jaw clenched, his mask of neutrality slipping for a moment. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Turner, but I stand by my officers' actions. They were doing their job." Marcus took a deep breath, his patience wearing thin. Doing their job or acting on biases they've never had to confront. "This town has a problem, Chief, and it's clear your department is at the heart of it." Chief Williams bristled, his face flushed. "I don't appreciate your insinuations. My department operates with integrity." "Integrity," Marcus said, his voice rising. "If that were true, I wouldn't be here right now. I'm not asking for special treatment, Chief. I'm asking for fair treatment for myself and every person who comes through this town." The chief's gaze hardened, his posture stiffening. Perhaps, Mr. Turner, you're simply not used to being questioned. In this town, everyone is subject to the same scrutiny. Marcus let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. That's the problem, Chief. I'm not afraid of scrutiny, I'm afraid of a system that treats innocent people as guilty based on the color of their skin. A tense silence fell between them, the air thick with unspoken resentment. Finally, Chief Williams looked away, his jaw tight. I'll review the incident with my officers. That's all I can promise. Marcus nodded, though he knew it was little more than a hollow gesture. I'll be expecting a follow-up, Chief. And if there isn't one, I have no problem taking this higher up. I know people in the Bureau who would be very interested in this story. The Chief's face paled slightly, and Marcus could see the hint of fear in his eyes. Good, he thought. Let him feel a fraction of the fear his family had felt. Without another word, Marcus turned and left the office, his shoulders squared and his mind resolute. He was far from finished with this fight. Outside the station, Marcus felt a sense of release. A weight lifted from his chest. He'd confronted the chief, exposed the prejudice in the department for what it was. But as he walked down the street, he noticed people staring, their faces filled with suspicion and judgment. It wasn't just the police, it was the entire town. The realization hit him hard, settling in his gut like a stone. These people didn't see him or his family as equals. To them, they were intruders, a disruption to the quiet ignorance they had grown comfortable in. Determined, Marcus made his way to the local community center. If this town wanted to watch, he'd give them something worth seeing. He approached the director, a middle-aged woman with a friendly demeanor, and introduced himself. Is there a space I could use for a small gathering, he asked. I'd like to speak to anyone who's interested in addressing the recent incidents with the police. The woman hesitated, her eyes widening slightly as she took in his determined expression. Well, we usually don't host meetings on such short notice, but I suppose we could set something up in the multi-purpose room. Thank you, Marcus replied, feeling a sense of purpose surge through him. An hour later, Marcus stood in front of a small gathering of locals, his heart pounding as he looked out at the faces staring back at him. There were curious expressions, skeptical frowns, and a few looks of open hostility. But there were also a few who seemed genuinely interested, their faces soft with curiosity. He took a deep breath, letting the tension melt away as he began to speak. My name is Marcus Turner, and I'm here with my family on vacation. We came to this town hoping for a peaceful, relaxing break. Instead, we faced judgment, suspicion, and hostility simply because we don't look like everyone else here. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Marcus continued, his voice strong. I've spent my life in law enforcement, working as an FBI agent, putting myself on the line to protect people, to uphold justice. But the treatment we've experienced here has made me question whether justice is even possible in a place like this. He could see the tension in the room, the uncomfortable shifting of bodies as people listened. But he pressed on, refusing to back down. I was arrested without cause, humiliated in front of my children. And when I confronted the police chief about it, he dismissed it as protocol, as standard procedure. He shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his face. Well, I'm here to say that this isn't right. It's not right to judge someone based on the color of their skin. It's not right to assume guilt based on appearance. A hand went up in the back, and Marcus nodded toward the young man who had raised it. Do you really think there's a problem here, or is this just a misunderstanding? The man asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Marcus looked him directly in the eye. This isn't about misunderstandings. This is about a culture of prejudice, of fear and suspicion that goes unchecked. My family and I are not here to cause trouble, but we won't tolerate being treated like criminals just because we're different. A few people nodded, a murmur of agreement spreading through the crowd. Others crossed their arms, their expressions hard, but Marcus didn't let it faze him. We're all part of this community, he continued, his voice steady. And we all have a responsibility to make it better, to make it fair. I'm not asking for special treatment, I'm asking for equal treatment. The director of the community center, who had been standing at the back, stepped forward, her face thoughtful. Thank you for speaking up, Mr. Turner. This town, well, maybe it does need to hear this. We could use some changes. A smattering of applause followed her words, and Marcus felt a glimmer of hope spark within him. This was just the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. As the crowd dispersed, a few people approached Marcus, shaking his hand and offering words of support. Some of them had stories of their own relatives or friends who had experienced similar treatment, moments that had gone unaddressed in the quiet corners of the town. Carla joined him after the meeting, her hand slipping into his, her eyes filled with pride. "You did it, Marcus," she said softly. "You stood up, and people listened." Marcus squeezed her hand, feeling a warmth spread through him. "It's a start," he replied, his voice filled with determination. "And we're not done yet." Together they walked out of the community center, the dark clouds overhead breaking to reveal a sliver of sunlight. It was a small sign, but one that filled Marcus with hope. The road ahead would be long and the battles far from over, but he knew one thing for certain. He would keep fighting for his family, for justice, and for the promise of a better, fairer world. After the meeting, news of Marcus's speech spread quickly through the town. Some of the locals who had attended shared their perspectives with others, and soon people began talking about the FBI agent who had the nerve to confront the police. But while Marcus hoped this would prompt reflection, the response was mixed. There were whispers of support, stories quietly shared of others who had experienced similar prejudice in this small, insular community. Yet, alongside these tales of quiet empathy, there were also louder, angrier voices from those who felt Marcus was out of line. The next morning, Marcus sat at the breakfast table with Carla and the kids, the local newspaper open in front of him. A small article on the front page referenced the incident at the community center, headlined "Out-of-Town FBI Agent Speaks Out Against Local Law Enforcement." Beneath it was a quote from Chief Williams, stating, "While our department maintains the highest standards, we're always open to constructive feedback." Carla scoffed as she read over his shoulder. "Always open to feedback?" "I doubt that," she muttered, shaking her head. Jamal, sitting across from them, looked up from his plate, concern evident on his young face. "Dad, are people going to be mad at you for what you said?" Marcus put down the paper, offering his son a reassuring smile. "Some might be, Jamal. But there are others who understand why I had to speak up. I want you to remember something: doing what's right isn't always popular, but it's always worth it." Jamal nodded, though his face remained tense. "I get it, Dad. But I just don't like how people look at us here. It's like they want us to leave." Marcus's heart sank as he listened, recognizing the unease and vulnerability in his son's voice. He reached across the table, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Listen, son, not everyone here feels that way. And even if they do, we're a strong family and we stick together no matter what. Okay." Jamal nodded again, his expression softening slightly, though the worry lingered in his eyes. After breakfast, Carla suggested they go out to the farmer's market, hoping a change of scenery might lighten the mood. The kids perked up at the idea, and soon they were driving toward the bustling town square, where stalls overflowed with fresh produce, baked goods, and handmade crafts. The market was vibrant, filled with locals and tourists alike, but as they walked among the stalls, Marcus could feel the weight of people's eyes on them. Some gave polite nods or tentative smiles, while others cast wary, suspicious glances. He felt Carla's hand tighten around his, and he knew she sensed it too. They stopped at a stall selling fresh pastries, and Carla bought a bag of warm croissants for the kids. As they turned to leave, an elderly woman standing at the stall next to them caught Marcus's eye. She gave him a hesitant smile, her expression soft and kind. "You're the one who spoke at the community center, aren't you?" she asked, her voice gentle. Marcus nodded, meeting her gaze. "Yes, I am. That was me." The woman's smile widened slightly. "I wanted to thank you. My grandson went through something similar with the police here last year. No one believed him when he tried to tell his story. It means a lot that you spoke up." Marcus felt a wave of warmth at her words, grateful for the unexpected support. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "I'm glad to know we're not alone." As they continued through the market, he encountered a few more people who offered quiet words of encouragement, sharing their own stories of injustice or simply expressing gratitude. But for every supportive face, there were others who glared openly, their expressions filled with resentment. The tension was palpable, a constant reminder of the divide his actions had created. One of the vendors, a man with a weathered face and a broad, mocking grin, called out as they passed, "Hey, Agent Turner, heard you're trying to make this town into some kind of city courtroom." Marcus stopped, his jaw tightening as he turned to face the man. Just trying to make sure everyone here is treated fairly. The man let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. Fairly? We don't need some outsider telling us how to live our lives. Maybe you'd be better off taking your family somewhere else. Carla, sensing the tension, placed a gentle hand on Marcus's arm. Let's go, she murmured. He's not worth it. Marcus took a deep breath, fighting the urge to respond. He knew she was right, that engaging would only make things worse. But the man's words lingered, a bitter reminder of the hostility simmering just below the surface. As they walked away, Marcus glanced over at Carla, her face tight with frustration. You okay? He asked, his voice soft. She gave him a tight smile, though her eyes held a flicker of anger. I'm fine. I just hate that they're doing this to you. To us. Marcus wrapped an arm around her, offering what comfort he could. We'll get through this, Carla. Together. They spent the rest of the morning at the market, keeping to themselves and enjoying what small moments of peace they could find. But as they left, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. Later that afternoon, as they returned to their rental, Marcus's phone buzzed with a call. He glanced at the screen, recognizing the number as one from the local news station. Taking a deep breath, he answered, half expecting another wave of hostility. Mr. Turner? This is Julie Sanchez from Channel 5 News. The voice on the other end said, her tone professional but warm. I heard about your speech at the community center, and I'd love to interview you. We think it's important for the public to understand the concerns you've raised. Marcus was silent for a moment, weighing the risks and benefits of going public. He knew that speaking out could draw more attention, both positive and negative, but he also felt a growing need to make sure his story and the stories of others who had suffered weren't ignored. After a beat, he replied, all right, Ms. Sanchez. When and where would you like to meet? The interview was scheduled for the following day, and Marcus spent the evening preparing, mentally and emotionally, for the questions he knew would come. He and Carla discussed potential topics, and she offered her support, even though he could see the worry in her eyes. The next day, they met Ms. Sanchez and her camera crew at a park near the beach, a quiet spot away from the crowds. She greeted them warmly, her demeanor calm and empathetic. As they began the interview, Ms. Sanchez asked Marcus about his experiences, his career, and the challenges he and his family had faced since arriving in town. Marcus spoke openly, sharing the frustration, the humiliation, and the hope he felt in trying to create change. My goal isn't to stir up trouble, he said, his voice steady as he looked into the camera. I simply want to ensure that people are treated fairly and with respect, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. This isn't just about me or my family, it's about every person who has ever felt like they were judged unfairly. Ms. Sanchez nodded, her expression thoughtful. What would you say to those who believe you're overreacting, that your experience was just an isolated incident? Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I would say that prejudice often hides in plain sight, in small actions, in quiet assumptions. It's easy to dismiss it as a misunderstanding when it doesn't affect you directly, but for those of us who live with it, it's very real, and it's time people start acknowledging that. The interview concluded with Ms. Sanchez thanking him for his courage and honesty. As they left, Marcus felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted. But he knew this was only the beginning. His words would soon be broadcasted, reaching every home in the town, sparking conversations he could only hope would lead to change. That evening, the news segment aired, and the family sat together, watching as Marcus's face filled the screen, his voice calm but powerful as he spoke. The kids listened intently, their faces a mixture of pride and wonder as they saw their father taking a stand. But not everyone was as supportive. Within minutes of the segment ending, Marcus's phone began buzzing with messages, some offering words of encouragement, others filled with anger and contempt. One text read, "Go back to where you came from. You're not welcome here." Another accused him of trying to ruin the town's reputation. Carla looked over at him, her face tense. "This is getting out of hand, Marcus. Some of these people are clearly angry. I'm worried about how far they might go." Marcus nodded, understanding her fear. He had anticipated backlash, but the intensity of it was unsettling. Still, he refused to back down. "We can't let them scare us into silence, Carla. If we don't stand up now, Nothing will ever change. That night, Marcus lay awake, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He knew the road to justice was long and often filled with resistance, but he felt a fierce determination burning within him. He would protect his family, he would confront the town's prejudices, and he would fight for a future where his children wouldn't have to face the same obstacles he had. As he finally drifted off to sleep, he held on to that hope, knowing it was the only thing that could sustain him in the battles to come. The days following Marcus's interview were anything but peaceful. The town felt as though it had split in two. On one side, there were those who supported Marcus, acknowledging the biases and prejudice that had quietly shaped their community for years. They offered him quiet words of encouragement in passing, nodding in solidarity as they saw him on the street. But on the other side were the townspeople who felt deeply threatened by his presence and the change he represented. Carla felt the tension everywhere they went. As she and the kids walked through town to pick up groceries one morning, she noticed the usual friendly nods and waves had grown cold. Neighbors who had once smiled at her now avoided eye contact. A few even whispered behind her back, the words troublemaker and outsiders floating just within earshot. Jamal and Zoe felt it too. At the playground, the other kids kept their distance, their eyes lingering a little too long as they whispered to one another. Jamal sat on the edge of the sandbox, his shoulders slumped as he stared at the ground, his usual spark dimmed. "Mom," he finally said, his voice small and uncertain. "Why don't they want to play with me anymore?" Carla's heart ached as she looked at her son, seeing the weight of the town's judgment settling on his young shoulders. "It's not you, Jamal," she said softly, kneeling down beside him. "Sometimes people don't understand things they haven't experienced, they're just scared." "But why?" he pressed, frustration evident in his voice. "Dad didn't do anything wrong. He's just trying to make things fair." Carla nodded, placing a comforting hand on his back. "I know, sweetheart. And you're right, your dad's doing the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing makes people uncomfortable, especially if it means they have to change." Jamal looked away, his face pensive. Carla could see the wheels turning in his mind, the questions he was still too young to answer, yet too old to ignore. She wished she could shield him from all of this, to give him the carefree childhood he deserved. But reality didn't offer them that luxury. As they walked home, Carla couldn't shake the worry gnawing at her. She knew Marcus had only spoken the truth, but the consequences of that truth were bearing down on them, threatening to pull their family into a storm of resentment and hostility they couldn't control. Meanwhile, Marcus had his own struggles. Calls from the town's police department had become a daily occurrence, the voices on the other end asking him to retract his statements, to consider the town's reputation. Chief Williams himself had called twice, his tone laced with thinly veiled threats disguised as friendly advice. "It would be wise to let things cool off, Mr. Turner," he had said in their last conversation, his voice tight with frustration. "This isn't the city. People here value tradition. They don't respond well to being told their way of life is wrong." Marcus had listened quietly, his mind racing with indignation, but he kept his tone calm. "Tradition isn't a justification for injustice, Chief," he had replied. "If the people in this town value respect and integrity, then they should welcome the opportunity to grow." The chief had responded with a huff, cutting the conversation short, but Marcus could tell the words had stung. For years, the town had operated under an unspoken Code 1 that allowed discrimination to flourish in silence. Marcus had lifted the veil, exposing the rot beneath, and it was clear the town wasn't ready for the change he demanded. Yet, despite the tension, Marcus held firm. He knew this was more than just a fight for fairness, it was a fight for his children's future. He would rather endure the hostility than allow them to grow up in a world where injustice went unchallenged. But as the days passed, he began to realize that the toll of his fight was weighing heavily on his family. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across their small rental, Marcus sat on the porch, his gaze fixed on the distant waves. Carla joined him, her face etched with worry. "How much longer can we keep this up, Marcus?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The kids are struggling. I'm struggling. This town, it's like it's turning on us." Marcus took her hand, the weight of her words settling on him. He knew she was right. Each day brought new challenges, new reminders that they were unwelcome. but he also knew that walking away now would only reinforce the town's belief that they could ignore the need for change. "I know it's hard, Carla," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "I never wanted it to come to this. But if we leave now, if we back down, then they win. They'll go right back to treating people like us the same way, and nothing will ever change." Carla's eyes filled with tears and she looked away, her voice trembling. I want our kids to be happy, Marcus. I want them to feel safe. I don't know if we can give them that here." Marcus felt his heart break at her words, the reality of their situation crashing down on him. He wished he could protect them, to shield them from the world's ugliness. But he also knew that his fight was for them, that every word he'd spoken, every stand he'd taken, was an act of love, a promise that he would never let them live in silence. After a long silence, he spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. "Carla, I love you. I love Jamal and Zoe. And I know this is hard, harder than I ever imagined. But I can't turn my back on this fight. Not when I see the way people look at our kids, the way they judge them without ever knowing who they are. We have to stand firm, not just for us, but for everyone who's been hurt by this." Carla looked up at him, her gaze filled with a mixture of pain and admiration. She knew he was right, that his fight was their fight. But the fear of what lay ahead lingered, an unspoken shadow over their resolve. As the week wore on, Marcus received a surprising invitation. Reverend Scott, the pastor of the town's only church, called and asked if Marcus would attend a Sunday service where he intended to address the community's divisions. Reverend Scott had attended Marcus's speech at the community center, and though he had remained silent, Marcus had sensed his support. The invitation was a welcome relief, a glimmer of hope that perhaps not everyone in the town opposed his message. Marcus agreed, and on Sunday morning he and his family made their way to the church. The building was modest, with whitewashed walls and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns across the wooden pews. The congregation filled the space, their faces a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and in some cases open hostility as Marcus and his family walked down the aisle. Reverend Scott greeted them warmly, guiding them to a seat near the front. His presence was calming, his kind eyes offering a silent assurance that they were welcome here. As the service began, Reverend Scott spoke about love, unity, and the importance of seeing beyond appearances. His words were gentle yet firm, a call for compassion that resonated through the room. "Fear is a powerful thing," he said, his voice carrying through the hushed space. "It makes us close our hearts, judge those we don't understand, and cling to what feels safe, even when it harms others. But love is stronger than fear. It asks us to see one another, to understand, and to let go of our biases." He paused, looking out at the congregation, his gaze soft but unwavering. This town is not immune to fear. We've all felt it, and we've all let it shape our lives. But now is the time to choose love, to choose to be better for ourselves and for the generations to come. The congregation was silent, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him, grateful for Reverend Scott's words. After the service, a few members of the congregation approached him, offering quiet words of support. But as they left the church, Marcus noticed a group of men gathered near the entrance, their faces hard, their eyes filled with resentment. One of them, a man with a thick, graying beard and a stern expression, stepped forward, blocking their path. "You think you can just come here and tell us how to live?" he asked, his voice low and hostile. "This is our town, not yours." Marcus held his gaze, his expression calm but firm. "I'm not here to tell anyone how to live. I'm here to stand up for what's right. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's time to ask yourself why." The man scowled, his jaw clenched. "People like you come here, thinking you're better than us, stirring up trouble. But you don't belong here. We won't let you ruin this town." Carla took a step forward, her voice steady and clear. "This town is already ruined if it's built on fear and prejudice. We're here to make things better, whether you like it or not." The man's face twisted with anger, but he said nothing, turning away with a huff. Marcus watched him go, a mixture of anger and sadness settling in his chest. He knew there were still battles to be fought, that the road to change would be long and fraught with resistance. But as he looked at his family standing together with unwavering strength, he felt a surge of hope. They had faced the storm together, endured the weight of prejudice and hostility, and emerge stronger. And as they walked away from the church hand in hand, Marcus knew that, no matter what lay ahead, they would continue this fight. For justice, for dignity, and for the promise of a better future. The morning air was crisp as Marcus, Carla, and the kids stood outside the town hall. The building, with its tall columns and aged stone facade, looked imposing against the pale sky. Despite the early hour, a crowd had gathered in front of the entrance, locals and a few journalists whispering in hushed tones. Some had come to support Marcus, but others had gathered out of curiosity, skeptical or even hostile. Inside, a town meeting was scheduled to address Marcus's recent experiences and the broader issues he had raised. Reverend Scott had spoken to the town council, encouraging them to hold this open forum, and with enough community pressure, they'd reluctantly agreed. Marcus had prepared carefully, but the look in his eyes told Carla he was bracing himself for a confrontation. Carla placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "No matter what happens in there, you've already made a difference, Marcus," she said softly. "People are talking. They're finally seeing what's been hidden for too long." Marcus nodded, glancing down at her and then at Jamal and Zoe, who held his hands on either side. "This is for them, Carla," he said, his voice determined. "I want them to know that they never have to accept disrespect. I want them to remember that when things are wrong, we don't just turn away." As they walked inside, Marcus saw a familiar face in the crowd, Chief Williams. The chief's face was a mask of neutrality, but Marcus could see the tension in his posture, the defensive stance of a man who'd been forced to confront uncomfortable truths. The town hall's main room was buzzing with chatter as people took their seats. Council members sat at a long table on a raised platform at the front, looking down at the crowd. Chief Williams took his place among them, his expression guarded. Reverend Scott stood at the podium, nodding as Marcus and his family entered and found seats near the front. "Good morning, everyone," Reverend Scott began, his voice steady. "We are here today to have an honest conversation about the recent events in our town. This conversation may be difficult, but I believe it's necessary if we are to grow as a community. We cannot ignore the concerns raised by Mr. Marcus Turner, a visitor who has brought to light some issues that deserve our attention." There were murmurs from the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Reverend Scott continued, gesturing for Marcus to come forward. "Mr. Turner, would you be willing to share your experience with us?" Marcus stood, his gaze steady as he walked to the podium. He took a deep breath, glancing at the audience before he spoke. "Thank you, Reverend Scott, and thank you to everyone here for giving me the chance to speak," he began. "When my family and I came here, we were looking for peace, a chance to relax and enjoy each other's company. But instead, we encountered suspicion, judgment, and hostility, simply because of who we are." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "I want you all to understand something. I am an FBI agent. I have dedicated my life to upholding the law, to protecting communities, and to seeking justice. Yet in this town, I was treated like a criminal. I was detained without cause, humiliated in front of my children, and made to feel as though I didn't belong here." A hush fell over the room as his words resonated with the audience. Marcus looked out at the crowd, his gaze unwavering. "The way I was treated is not unique. It's a symptom of a larger problem, one that goes beyond me and my family. It's about the assumptions we make, the biases we hold, and the way we allow those biases to influence our actions." An older man in the audience raised his hand, his voice carrying through the room. "But what about the safety of our town? We have to look out for suspicious behavior. Isn't that what you do as an FBI agent?" Marcus met the man's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, I do, but suspicion should be based on actions, not on appearances. Judging someone solely because they look different is not only unfair, it's dangerous. It erodes trust and undermines the principles of justice we're supposed to uphold." He turned to face Chief Williams, who shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "Chief, your officers had no reason to treat me the way they did. They ignored my credentials, dismissed my rights, and acted out of prejudice rather than professionalism. That's not the kind of community I want my children to grow up in." The chief cleared his throat, his voice defensive. "My officers were following procedure, Mr. Turner. They acted based on the reports they received, and I stand by their actions." Marcus shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his face. "Following procedure doesn't justify prejudice, Chief. If you refuse to acknowledge the bias within your department, then nothing will ever change. A young woman in the back of the room stood up, her voice filled with frustration. This isn't just about you, Mr. Turner. Some of us have been dealing with this our whole lives. My brother was harassed by the police last year for no reason, and nothing was done about it. Her words sparked murmurs of agreement, and a few others stood, sharing their own stories of encounters with the police, moments of judgment and unfair treatment that had gone unaddressed. Marcus listened, his heart heavy yet encouraged by the outpouring of truth. Reverend Scott gestured for calm, allowing each person to finish speaking before he turned back to Chief Williams. Chief, it seems clear that this isn't just an isolated incident. There are people in this community who feel they've been treated unfairly. Perhaps it's time to take a closer look at how your department operates. Chief Williams's face flushed, and he shifted in his seat, his voice tight with frustration. My department is not responsible for the personal grievances of a few people. We do our best to serve and protect, but we can't please everyone. Marcus took a step forward, his voice calm but resolute. Chief, this isn't about pleasing people. It's about justice. It's about treating every person with dignity, regardless of who they are or where they come from. If you're unwilling to address the bias in your department, then you're failing the very people you're sworn to protect. The room was silent, all eyes on Chief Williams as he grappled with the weight of Marcus's words. Reverend Scott spoke up, his tone gentle but firm. Chief, perhaps this is an opportunity for growth. We all have room to improve, to become more compassionate, more understanding. I believe this community deserves that effort. After a long pause, Chief Williams sighed, his shoulders slumping as he met Marcus's gaze. Fine, he muttered, his voice grudging. I'll review our procedures and ensure our officers receive training on implicit bias. But I want it on record that my department has always acted in good faith. Reverend Scott nodded, a faint smile of relief crossing his face. Thank you, Chief. This is a step in the right direction. Marcus felt a surge of hope, a sense that perhaps finally the town was beginning to change. He returned to his seat beside Carla, who squeezed his hand, pride shining in her eyes. The meeting concluded with Reverend Scott encouraging the town to come together, to foster empathy and understanding, to embrace the differences that made their community stronger. As people filed out, some approached Marcus, offering words of support and gratitude. A few even apologized, acknowledging the pain their silence had caused. Outside the town hall, Carla looked up at him, a smile breaking through the tension that had weighed on her for days. You did it, Marcus. You made them see. Marcus shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. No, we did it. This wouldn't have been possible without you and the kids. You all gave me the strength to keep fighting. Jamal and Zoe stood beside them, their faces alight with pride and admiration. Jamal looked up at his father, his eyes wide with newfound respect. Dad, you're like a real-life hero. Marcus chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. A hero, huh? I don't know about that, but I do know that standing up for what's right is something we should all try to do, even when it's hard. As they walked back to their car, Marcus felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road had been long, filled with challenges he hadn't anticipated. But through it all, he had held true to his principles, standing up not only for his family but for everyone who had been silenced by fear and prejudice. They drove back to the rental house in quiet reflection, the weight of the past few weeks lifting as they realized that their fight had left a lasting impact on the town. It wasn't a complete transformation, change would be slow, with setbacks along the way. But the first step had been taken, and that was more than Marcus had dared to hope for when he'd first spoken out. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the beach, Marcus and his family walked along the shore. The waves lapped gently at their feet, the salty breeze carrying away the remnants of tension that had clung to them for so long. Jamal and Zoe ran ahead, laughing as they chased each other across the sand, their laughter a joyful reminder of why Marcus had fought so hard. Carla slipped her hand into his, leaning her head on his shoulder as they watched their children play. This is what I wanted for us, she murmured, her voice soft. A place where we could be together, happy and at peace. Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. We've earned it, Carla. And no matter what challenges lie ahead, I know we can face them together. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the horizon, its golden rays stretching across the water in a final burst of warmth and light. It was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, not only for their family but for the community they had touched. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Marcus felt a profound sense of hope. They had endured the storm, stood against the tide of prejudice, and emerged stronger, bound by love and resilience. And in that moment he knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, with courage, with faith, and with a vision of a world where justice and dignity were rights for all.